Well, hello, folks. Thanks for joining this particular section or lecture called "The Anatomy of Hatred." It's powerful, not the lecture itself, but the subject. And usually, when I'm talking about this particular subject in other classrooms, traditional classroom settings, what I often do, in fact, what I always do, is show a documentary in its entirety called Fall from Grace. Now, you can get it on Netflix, and I hope you do. I hope you read the entirety or watch the entirety of that documentary because unfortunately, with online classes, I can't do that. But what I can do is encourage you to watch it, and it's a tough watch, and yet it probably the story of Fred Phelps and his family and his church and his causes demonstrate probably the best, um, demonstrate probably the cross section of hatred in the best way. I don't know any other way to say it other than you'll notice as you watch that it's pretty powerful. Because many and perhaps most of you won't be able to watch it in its entirety, what I've done is I've posted on Moodle a number of different YouTube clips, some of which are taken from the movie, the documentary. Others have posted their own or made their own documentaries, and there are portions of that found. And so what I'd like you to do is actually go ahead and go to YouTube or into Moodle and watch these clips. And you can do that after this lecture if you want. You can stop now and go and watch them. Either way, but here's a passage of scripture to kind of guide you, if you would, in your understanding and processing of the anatomy of hatred. The writer to the Hebrews says, "Look after each other so that none of you fails to receive the grace of God. Watch out that no poisonous root of bitterness grows up to trouble you, corrupting many." A little personal disclosure that I don't mind relating to all of you on this online class. There was a number of years ago, back when I was a pastor, where my wife, now my wife of 30 years, at the time, probably my wife of 10, 11 years, asked me kind of this pointed question. She says, two questions actually. She says, "Why are you so grouchy? And why are you so tired?" Well, my initial reaction was to defend my grouchiness and to defend my weariness up against the backdrop of I was very busy. I was pastoring. I was the pastor of a very growing church, a lot of responsibilities. Well, here's what happened, folks. I sat down with someone like myself, paid them good money to discern in my own spirit, to help me discern in my own spirit that I was becoming a bitter person. There had been some things that had happened in my ministry. There had been some things that had happened in my life where I hadn't been paying attention to them enough. And a root of bitterness, or as the writer of the Hebrews says, a poisonous root of bitterness, started to grow up in me and not only troubled me, but was spilling over into my marriage and spilling over also into my relationship with my children to the point where at the time my son Caleb basically said the same thing to me or asked me the same thing. And he says, Dad, why are you so grouchy? Well, that's a personal that's a personal story, and I think we all have our stories. But here's what I want you to pay attention to in your own life, and then also as you watch those different clips, uh, pay attention to how the poisonous root of bitterness grew up in Fred Phelps, grew up to trouble him, and corrupted many. Again, you all aren't able to watch the entire documentary unless you choose to. But particularly want you to watch for a number of things in the clips. It's a dangerous thing, folks, to believe that you or your organization or your church is the sole proprietor of the truth. Or, as is often the case, and I haven't necessarily heard this language specifically, but sometimes I get the impression as I'm talking with various organizations that God's on our side and not on the side of others. I do believe clearly in the teachings of Micah chapter 6, verse 8, that says, These things have I required of you, God speaking through Micah to the people of Israel, to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. Well, not only in this clip or these clips that you're going to watch, but when you are part of an organization or you're a part of an organization, perhaps a church, whatever, where there's this fundamental belief that we're the only people that have the truth and that God is on our side, um, that's a dangerous place to be. And I think just as a result of being in that place, mercy takes a hit, humility takes a hit. So anyway, watch for some of this. And what often characterizes this particular dynamic in organizations where bitterness has taken root is you find what we used to call a lot of proof texting, springboarding, I guess, where there's one or two passages that are used repeatedly to support passages of the Bible, used to support their cause or their anger, when there's a whole host of other biblical passages that say, hey, you may not have the corner on the truth. And certainly the way you're treating other people is disastrous. As we learned in our conversation about systems talk, as much as anxiety is contagious in a system, so is bitterness. It's very infectious. It's toxic. I'm particularly sensitive down through the years to pay attention to religious rage. I'm just fascinated at how when an organization or a religious organization believes that they have the truth and that God is on our side, how that spreads to the point where there's just all out rage, as you saw in a couple of the clips, to the point where it spreads to the entire system. I've learned down through the years also to pay attention to the countenance of hatred. Now, let me dial this back just a little bit to give you a different story because, quite frankly, some of the stuff surrounding the Fred Phelps stuff, the organization, can be overwhelming. So let me just dial it back a bit and tell you this story. Not too long ago, a woman who has gone through just a lot of pain sits in my office and tells me the story of her pain, some of which included a marriage that didn't last, and it didn't last because there was some infidelity involved. And as she tells me her story, at the end of the first session I had with her, I told her, I think you're going to be okay. I can't promise you though that life is going to turn out okay, or you get your husband back, or I said that's not what I can do. But I said, personally, I think you're going to be okay. And she says, why? And I said, because you don't do bitterness well. And she says, what do you mean? I said, I've been watching your countenance. I've been watching you as you tell your story. And I said, I've been watching your eyes. And you don't have the eyes of anger. You have the eyes of pain. You have the eyes of brokenness. But clearly, you won't do bitterness well if you keep doing life the way you're doing it. And I said, I'm more than willing to help you keep, and my words, again, Paul's words, or whoever wrote Hebrew, I'll do what I can to keep the root of bitterness springing up in you, because right now you're broken, right now you're in a lot of pain, but sometimes that brokenness and that pain can lead to bitterness. And I can see that in the eyes. I can see that, folks, not because I'm an interventionist, not because I'm a therapist. It's just, look around. Look at the people who have really become bitter, and you can see it in their eyes. And again, it's one thing to watch video clips of kind of this religious freak show. It's another thing to say, but what about me? Am I becoming bitter in life? One of the areas that stood out when I watched the full documentary Fall from Grace, and my traditional classroom students also point out the effects upon the children. Um, if you watch the entire documentary, and it may perhaps in some of the clips that are on Moodle for you, you'll see the stories. You'll hear the stories of children who left the compound, so to speak, and were treated as infidels. But you'll also see in the eyes of some of the children who are still part of the the mix of the Fred Phelps organization, what we call generational transmission, meaning the bitterness left unchecked in one generation gets passed to the next, and gets passed to the next, and gets passed to the next. So if you study the story of the Fred Phelps, if you study Fred Phelps' story, there's sometimes where you can see right in one frame or in one story 4 generations that have taken on this bitterness to the point where these beautiful blue-eyed, blonde-haired kids are calling people names because that's what they heard mom and dad call them, and that's what they heard grandpa, and that's what they heard grandpa's grandpa call these individuals. Last, you don't have to watch just this video or these videos to see this, but again, we go back to a teaching, a fundamental teaching of Jesus. I believe it's found in Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus is, I believe, speaking to his disciples, and he says to them, go and learn what this means. He says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. In other words, folks, I don't think God's all that impressed with how busy we are or how many sacrifices we're making. I do think he pays attention to the mercy factor in our lives. In other words, when we are angry with someone or when we believe we're right, how are we doing? Or even when we've been hurt by someone, how are we doing in giving back to those individuals a high level of mercy? Now, we're going to talk about forgiveness at a different time. We really will. But I just want you to know there's something to be said as you watch these particular videos and post your reactions to them. There's something to be said for watching how mercy just isn't even a part of the equation. And the bottom line is it does need to be a part of the equation, not just in understanding and managing conflict, but it needs to be a part of the equation. A, because God said so. B, because if we're going to understand and manage conflict well, we need to be people who give and receive mercy well. So that's the end of this particular lecture. I'm not going to tell you to enjoy the clips because they're not enjoyable, but I hope they're learning tools for you, not just so you can post well about them, but that you can come away and say, hey, how about me? Is bitterness a part of who I am? Has the bitterness become infectious and toxic to the point where those around me are indicating that I'm a little bit tough to be around? I mean, that's in large measure the redemptive part of this lecture, and that is the self-awareness, what's going on in me. Thanks, folks.